Do you know what YouTube, Google, and Duolingo all have in common? They don't just rely on sleek design or clever copy, they use behavioral science to shape every click, every decision, and every habit. Today I'm talking with Katie Dove from Irrational Labs, and she's unpacking the psychology behind how we build digital products that actually drive action. From psychological friction to mental models to why most user feedback is misleading, this episode is full of insights you will want to apply immediately. Katie, welcome to No Hacks. What a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about the 3B framework. This is what you do. This is what Irrational Labs is known for. It's your in-house framework. What are the 3Bs? Let's start there.
Yeah, and so for me, actually, if you don't mind, I'll take a step back and talk a little bit about just human behavior.
Please do, yes.
3B framework is how we interpret the world around us and how we understand how people make decisions in the world around them, whether it be in physical settings or digital settings. And maybe I'll tell you a little bit more about me so that you have a context of how I make decisions that maybe will generalize to you. So TLDR, I like to walk. I'm a big walker. I'm not a big fan of exercise, but I find walking peaceful, especially this time of year in New York where it's a little nicer outside. My doctor tells me it's good for me. And in general, anyone who has a desk job knows that they should be getting up and moving around, moving their body, taking breaks. New York is a very walkable city. This works out well for me. That said, if it's raining, I'm not walking. If it's above 85 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm not walking. If I'm going to a party and wearing heels, I'm not walking. And so it turns out that most people, for most things, kind of have these deeply ingrained beliefs, preferences, identities, values. I identify as a walker, and yet I don't always act in accordance with this. And really, the interesting thing is, why don't we act in accordance with our values and beliefs? And the truth is, context just matters quite deeply. And so again, if I told you, okay, I'm not walking, it's raining, I look at Uber, Uber $70, well, turns out I'm walking. And in digital context, this is really confusing. You have all of these inputs about what your users are telling you they want or they need, and yet they don't act in accordance with those beliefs and values and preferences. Nothing has changed about me, but the context has changed. And so when we think about the 3B behavior change framework, what we're really trying to do is understand kind of the predictable ways in which people don't act in accordance with those beliefs and preferences and values. And so the 3B framework at the highest level, I'm very happy to double click into each of these, is basically saying, okay, well, what is the actual behavior I want someone to do differently or do for the first time? And oftentimes when we work with companies, they're like, oh, well, I want to drive engagement. I want to reduce churn. But these things are not behaviors. They're not actually telling you what you want the user to do differently. A good example would be like, okay, not users on ClassPass will exercise more. It's within 7 days of sign up, a new ClassPass user maybe will complete a registration for 2 or 3 different classes with different instructors. And this specificity gives us something that we can actually design for. And then the second B is, okay, well, what's all the friction that's getting in the way of that, whether that be logistical or psychological? And then what we want to do is reduce that friction or remove it as much as possible and increase the psychological motivation, or the third B, the benefits, to get them over the hump. So at the highest level, that's what the 3B framework is. Very happy to kind of double click into any aspect.
Right, but it's really about the one action, if you break it down, the one action you want the user to take it, that they are taking, you want more of it, you want them to start for the first time, and then eliminate the barriers, work on the benefits. When you say it like that, it's simple. But human mind is anything but simple. I mean, even your company is Irrational Labs, and then for a reason, like people are irrational. So let's get into this a bit more. Let's talk about barriers, because I think most people, when you're in conversion rate optimization, you think about barriers, like what's stopping the user from doing what I want them to do. So how do you identify what the barriers are in the digital space when the user is not telling you that directly?
Yeah, good question. And it's also a question we get a lot, which is like, how will you know why they're not doing this thing if we don't ask them? And well, it turns out, like, if you ask them, you still may not know. Asking customers means that you're going to be subject to a lot of misdirection, kind of like I was just telling you about with me walking. So in general, what we know from behavioral science is there's 2 categories of barriers or types of friction. There's logistical friction and there's psychological friction. And we know a lot about these types of friction or cognitive biases that come into play dependent on which one you're talking about. So I think the easier of the two is to understand like logistical friction. So this is stuff like, okay, in a digital flow, a sign up flow, perhaps you have 20 different text boxes in a form. This is obvious. Like, this is the definition of logistical friction, right? And it can also be just confusing UI if you don't know, if there's no paternalism, you don't know which ones actually are required or which ones you should fill in. Yeah, and then there's also within logistical friction, there's these timing issues. And just as an example, I have to renew my driver's license this month. I logged in, I got a notification about four weeks ago or so. So pretty early in advance via the mail. I go to log in and I'm going to the flow. I get about halfway through and they're like, oh, please upload your eye exam results from within the last year. And I was like, oh, I didn't know I had to do this. Yeah. I mean, it kind of makes sense that I should have an eye exam, but why are you telling me halfway through? That's logistical friction, the definition of logistical friction. And I've waited till a couple of weeks out. Now I have to set up an appointment. The DMV in the United States is notorious for being quite frictionful in a lot of ways. And so at this point, likely I drop off or I have to take some other action and likely not today. And so that's one category of friction. The other is psychological friction. And so these tend and can be a lot more difficult to overcome. These are well understood cognitive biases that work against us when we're trying to do something or do something differently. These are things like status quo bias. So I continue to do whatever it is I've done before simply because I've done it before. Right. This is choice overload. We have too many choices. I don't have the time to investigate this now. I'll come back, but I don't because later never comes. This is present bias. And sometimes we have both psychological friction and logistical friction within a given flow. And, like TMI, but like I'm supposed to get this annual mammogram 10 years prior to my immediate family history. I've put it off the past 2 years, partly because of logistical friction. I need to schedule it and find a provider in a location, but also because of psychological friction. There's something called information aversion. And I'm not sure I actually want to know the answer. So to your question about like, how do you know these things if you don't ask the user, or maybe we don't have these X-ray glasses? Well, it turns out there's this entire discipline of behavioral science that has really, really studied these cognitive bias in action and not only have identified them, but have given us some tools to overcome them.
And the two different barriers, but psychological and logistical, that's external and internal basically for the user. If there's an obstacle that's just stopping you from doing, that's the logistical. The psychological is I'm not doing this for my own reasons, whatever they are, justified or not. Is that a way to describe it or not?
Not exactly. It would be nice if that was the rule of thumb, right? Because it would be easier to identify these things in practice. But sometimes psychological barriers can be acting on you from an external force. So in psychology, there's this concept of the Hawthorne effect, which is like, I may be more likely to do something because I know someone is watching me. So like think of washing your hands or things of that nature, not texting and driving. I would love to know that because I have a passenger, I therefore want text and driving, yet we see this all the time on the road. So some of these things can be external forces in our environment, in our context, that are still psychological in nature.
Makes a lot of sense. So how do you align the experience of the user and what you want to design for that experience with the goals that the organization has? Like, is there a framework for that? Is that a part of the 3B framework, or how does it work?
Yeah, it's related to the 3B framework, right? So when we start to work with an organization or anybody who's trying to apply behavioral design to behavior change, the thing you want to identify, of course, is that what's the key behavior? And the very first step in what we would call a behavioral design process is just problem immersion. What do we know about this behavior already? Who has solved similar behaviors like this, either in the same context or in lateral context? What tests have people already run in this domain? I know you kind of come from this like CRO background. So like we know a lot about certain types of design patterns. Let's use that as our starting point. And then the next step in the process is actually just the behavioral map. So you take your key behavior, you put it at the end of the map. What are all the steps from an entry point to that key behavior that someone would need to take? And when I say steps, I mean clicks, of course, reading, etc., but also decisions you're asking people to make, either implicitly or explicitly. And if you're asking them to make a decision, what other stakeholders are involved in that decision-making process? And that's where we start to get into the real meat of the exercise, where we are applying the other GBs, the benefits and the barriers. So as we look at that map, what are all of the hypothesized psychological barriers that are getting in the way? Are they adding sufficient motivation or benefits to get people over the hump? And then we start to do this ideation process. Okay, so based on what we know from the literature, what can we actually do to motivate someone to get past the psychological barrier? Are we able to remove it? Actually designing concepts around that and then testing those. So that's when we think about the behavioral design process, it's really those 5 stages: problem immersion, behavioral mapping, identifying the psychological barriers, adding benefits, do this design and ideation process, and testing and learning.
When you explain it like that, it sounds very simple.
Yeah.
I know it's not. Also, it sounds.
I generally think behavioral science is like one of those things that, like, oh, if you look at it in hindsight, there is literally a thing called hindsight bias, right?
Yeah.
Of course, like if you look at it in hindsight, you're like, oh, this is obvious. I should have been doing this all along. And yet it's very difficult in the moment. Why? Because we're still attention scarce creatures. We have a lot of different things competing for our resources, especially in business environments. And so it's easy to miss these things.
But also, you don't know things that you will know when you're done with the project and when you're
Totally.
going to read your
Totally.
resources. It sounds like a board game almost. You know what the final field is, you know where the obstacles are, where the boosts are, and then you know how to get, you're trying to find your way to get there as quickly as possible.
I love this.
Let's do a rapid fire question. 5 questions, 20 seconds or less for each one. Ready?
Wonderful.
What's the most irrational thing you've done today?
Ooh, most irrational. I hit snooze. I know I should get up earlier. I should get ready sooner. And yet I hit snooze. Not once, not twice.
Respecting the honesty. Which app, speaking of snooze, which app on your phone most needs a behavioral science overhaul?
Oh my goodness. And app limits, which is technically not an app, but it's within your settings. Yes. Friction will stop us from doing something. If there's friction is extremely easy to overcome, it will not stop me. If I hit ignore and continue to play on Instagram.
And describe your job to a 5-year-old in 10 words or less.
Oh, this is such a hard one. Do you want the cookie? Are you willing to wait?
What's more dangerous, an overconfident CEO or a bad data set?
Ooh. I'm going to go with bad data set because I think the micro decisions that are made daily probably affect a greater volume, whereas with the CEO, hopefully you have backstops in place through other decision makers.
Hopefully. That's the keyword. The final one, and I know you watched The Bear. If you had to explain the 3B framework using a kitchen metaphor, how would you do it?
Ooh, a kitchen metaphor. If the potato chips are in sight, I will eat them. If they're hidden in a cupboard and I have to use a step stool, I will not.
Wow. You aced all of these. Amazing. Now let's talk about behavioral design some more.
Okay.
How does demonstrating effort rather than just optimal outcomes affect customer satisfaction?
Good question. Okay, so let's take this a step back to the 3B framework, right? So a key behavior is what you're ultimately trying to move. And what makes for a good key behavior? It's observable, it's measurable, it's uncomfortably specific. And importantly, it's also something within a user's control, especially in digital flows, right? And so effort is one of those things that is maybe less visible, but there are proxies that we can use, and it's also within the user's control. So as an example, if we think about weight loss, it's extremely easy to feel discouraged when trying to change my behaviors around nutrition and exercise. Well, for a lot of reasons, right? One, and perhaps the largest, is that it's just a nonlinear process. I can do all the right things today. I can go to the gym. I can eat a healthier breakfast and also still gain weight. And tomorrow I can skip my 45-minute walk and have lost a pound by mid-morning. And so there are these intraday fluctuations that have no to low correlation with ultimately the behavior I would like to drive. And this is true, by the way, not just in nutrition and weight loss, but also in other areas where we have bad feedback or have a lack of feedback. So finances is another one. It's extremely subject to external shocks. My car breaks down, I wipe out my savings overnight. And so like for this reason, there are all sorts of behaviors that we take both online and offline where progress is not linear. And if you want to move long-term outcomes, you really have to focus on getting them to do the right thing and in a consistent way every day, such that they don't get discouraged by these external shocks or these fluctuations and exogenous variables that are not really within their control. And so digitally, a great example of this is like Duolingo. Language learning is not a linear process. I don't open the app, do it for 15 minutes a day, and all of a sudden I'm fluent. In fact, I can do this every day for months and I may still not be fluent, but why do I keep coming back? It's the streaks. It's the social component.
It's the owl. just calling you back. Like basically, that's what they've done. I mean, let's be honest. Most people do it when the mascot says, "Hey, I miss you." Some even had like a dead owl or something for a while.
They still
Some
do around
pushback.
11 p.m. I may
They
have hit that one a few times.
wow. You
Or it looks like
mentioned
he's in purgatory.
it's horrible. And now they're firing all human contractors. I read that a few days ago. That is going to get weird real soon. You mentioned bad feedback and no feedback. For you doing your work, is no feedback or really, really bad feedback a worse option?
Ooh, interesting.
And I'm
Jay.
not saying this could be better. This is like 2 out of 5, 3 out of 5. I mean, really, really, really bad. Kanye West kind of bad.
It's tough because I think in my line of work, I rely on so much that has been empirically studied that, and I also work in client services, so we
Nice.
don't always get feedback. So I'm inclined to say that bad feedback is almost worse because it can feel like you're kind of subject to these external pressures that are pushing you in
I
a
mean, we're
direction
working
that's
with a
incorrect.
client, just to be clear, not Irrational Labs bad feedback. Like, that's not happening.
No, but even still, it's still kind of true, right? So,
Mhm.
well, yes. So let's actually take the Duolingo example.
Mhm.
What's worse, bad feedback or no feedback? Well, no feedback perhaps means that there's this lack of acknowledgement that feels quite dissatisfying, whereas bad feedback, perhaps I'm more likely to try and want to overcome. There's actually an interesting study about this that had to do with how long people were willing to persist with a task. I think it was like a writing task.
Mhm.
And they would, in one condition, fill out the task, bring it to the grader. The grader would read it. And then after they read it, they would shred the document and ask them if they want another. Versus you fill out the whole document, you bring it to the grader, and they don't read it. They immediately shred it and ask you if you want another one. So this is kind of the embodiment of the question of no feedback or bad feedback. It almost feels better to have bad feedback in that instance, which is like, I'm at least signaling that I've done something with it, than no feedback, because if we come back to effort versus outcomes, it feels slightly more rewarding.
Mhm. That's a good answer. Now, let's talk about the psychological barriers in user engagement specifically. Let's say you're working with an app, you're trying to increase user engagement. What are the most common psychological barriers?
Yeah, good question. So very context dependent. I think
Yeah.
that's the one of the fundamental principles of behavioral science. It's not that we do like things or don't like things. It's like in which environment.
Yeah.
So, but that being said, the top ones I see again and again are instantiations of things like people don't understand present bias. So we put an unrealistically high value on the here and now and a relatively low value on the future. And as a result, people prefer rewards that are immediate and emotional over ones that arrive later. And yet, when I work with folks in their digital flows, sometimes what they're trying to motivate users with are these long-term abstract benefits, right? So I'll give you an example of a recent case. I worked with a top 5 bank in Brazil, and they were trying to get users to set up autopay, right? So something that's important to know about Brazil is they have some of the highest late fees in the world. And they also have customers that have 5+ different banks and or banking relationships. And attention is scarce, as we know. And even though that we know this may be better for us in the long term, there's this abstract possibility that someday I might forget to make the payment. We don't value that here and now enough to go and try and find in settings where this is, or maybe I'm just not even thinking about autopay. It's not even on my radar. I don't know that this is a feature that I can use, or maybe I have some peripheral knowledge that this is it. And so what did we do? They wanted people to set on autopay. It's very pro-social benefit. It's good for them in terms of actually getting payments, but also good for their users in terms of not accumulating fees. And so to overcome present bias, we need to give folks a reason to act today, which means two things. One, it means increasing their attention on the ask, and it means giving them some sense of the relative benefits at hand. And so you need to make the cost of inaction clear. So we had 2 designs, one where we overlaid just the next time they log into their banking app, there was a modal that said, do you want to join the over 90% of new users who have set up autopay, right? So there's 2 different groups of customers. There's the people who have been long-term customers and new users. For new users, you can default them into this now that I know that I want people to use autopay, or at least ask them in the onboarding. But for existing users, very hard group of people to use because they have this status quo bias, right? And so for the first condition, it was like, yes, I want to set up autopay, or no, maybe later. And what do we know about maybe later? it never comes and we forget about it and we move on with our lives, versus condition 2, which was, yes, I want to set up auto pay, or no, I will remember to pay manually. And this is a very actually common design practice or pattern. But really why it works is because it creates this sense of opportunity cost or cost in action. And in psychology, there's this thing called opportunity cost neglect, which is we're not really kind of evaluating all their options in respect to like what actually are my trade-offs. And so we've made the trade-off very clear. I will remember to pay manually. And I think, okay, well, will I? And if I don't, it's very clear what my cost is.
And it's very clear that it's your fault.
It's very clear.
And you're just accepting that it's going to be your fault next time you pay a late fee. That's a really good example. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also kind of related to status quo bias, of course. Existing users will do whatever they've done before, because when I made the account in the first place, I must have said I didn't want to enroll in auto pay. So there must have been a reason for this. It could have just been intentional differences. And of course, there are lots of ways to overcome status quo bias. If we think about Uber or Lyft, they have the same logistical barriers as taxis. There's this wait time, but they overcame the status quo, especially in New York City, by overcoming the cognitive or psychological barrier of uncertainty around arrival time. And so that's one way that you can overcome status quo, is just give them a sense that there is some other benefit that's available. And maybe one other, the most common, is mental models. Like, do people understand what a mental model is? Are they creating the right mental model for their users? Are they creating the wrong mental model for their users? Do they even know what the reference points are for their mental model? So if we think about LinkedIn Premium, what is the mental model for that subscription? Well, most people have LinkedIn Free as the mental model. And so they're going to be comparing that from a relative perspective. We worked with Google AdWords some time ago with new advertisers who wanted to set up an AdWords account and set up campaigns, but weren't necessarily super familiar with the tool. These are new advertisers, small businesses, very long tail of users for Google. And what we noticed is folks were setting up these budgets and turning them on and checking back a few days later, getting discouraged by the results, and then bailing. And so what can you do? And what is the mental model that folks have around these AdWords accounts? Maybe they've heard about them from a friend or another advertiser, and they've heard about the success, but they haven't gotten that, like, well, how long does it take to get success? And when we looked at their data, it takes on average 3 months for people to start reaping the rewards of these campaigns. And so if as behavioral designers, we can create a mental model around this. Well, we can say, okay, now you're part of this expert AdWords program. The 3-month program, 3 months. We actually set up future calls with them, with the call center, to check in on how their campaigns were going, and we're able to drive quite a impressive result, 14% increase on retention, just by changing the mental model of what it takes to see success, moving from short term, I'll turn these on and start to reap rewards, to something that is a little bit more long term.
But this is simply setting expectations for these new users who never worked with the platform, who would think that, in a week it should start working, because they don't have a mental model or any references, right?
Yes. And so it is a lot about expectations, right? In fact, that's a really great, succinct way to explain mental models. And when we think about Duolingo, the mental model they're creating, if you get to that, how much would you like to practice today? Are you casual? 5 minutes. Are you regular? 10 minutes. This is a mental model they're forming. We also worked with One Medical, which is a health benefit provided by employers to their employees. And you get this email that says, create your sign up for your One Medical benefits. You go through this really long onboarding flow. On the 14th screen, you land on the landing page. You're now enrolled and it says get care. Well, if I am not in the mindset that I'm sick, the likelihood that I do anything on that screen today is basically slim to none. And so what is the mental model they're creating? It's for people who are sick today. And their key behavior was, well, we want more people to sign up for preventative appointments. And in this instance, we actually added friction. We added a page that said, meet your provider. The next step, the mental model of what is the correct next step, becomes, okay, it's just to meet my provider.
Right.
And so there are different ways you can change the mental model. But I think mental models do kind of boil down to these expectations. What are the expectations you're forming for the user in the moment?
And also, I mean, this is from CRO. If you're not setting the expectations for what the funnel is going to look like, you have no right to expect the user will know anything about what's about to happen, and the conversion becomes significantly less likely, I would say. So yeah, this is if you're keeping them in the dark, the user or whoever you're working with, you have no right to expect things are going to go your way, basically. That's
Totally.
the CRO part of it. So back to 3B framework and let's say someone's listening who wants to start implementing 3B framework in their business. Step one, like where do they start?
Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit, but really it's that 5-step approach, right?
Right.
So problem immersion. So let's talk about what you could actually do during problem immersion, because I think that's a little abstract. So part of this is like looking at your pest test results, but that's not going to give you the answer, right? It'll just give you the answer for a very particular instantiation of an idea. I like this example from Yuri Nizi, who's a behavioral economist. He talks about like, well, it's someone who goes to a restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, and they eat the food and they're like, they don't like it. And so do they make the extrapolation that they don't like Chinese food? Well, maybe, but probably not. Why? Because that's just that one restaurant. That's one instantiation of an idea of a food, right? Same thing with behavior. So test results are nice as an input for the problem immersion phase, but they're certainly not the full picture. So what else can you do? We often do a literature review. So this is don't reinvent the wheel. Actually look at the existing research in this space and what we know both about the cognitive bias, but how people have been able to move those behaviors with different techniques. We sometimes in the problem immersion phase, we look at lateral categories. And so this would be like, who does loyalty well? If you ask people about their phone, like what apps on your phone do loyalty well? Perhaps they say, well, in general, Apple does loyalty well. It's kind of a close, for a long time, it was a closed system. In retail location or retail environment, they may say Nike, but you could take it back a step and say, well, actually, the church does loyalty well. People really identify with their religion. Or if you take it back one step farther, sports fans, sports enterprises do loyalty well. Trust me, my partner is an Arsenal fan, and hopefully folks listening don't take offense to that. But if you even have any reference to Tottenham, he'll lose his mind. That is a good example as doing loyalty well. And so you can kind of draw inspiration from these different domains and say, well, how did they create an environment of extreme loyalty? And what can we learn from that? We think about this all the time in sustainability domains. Like Prius, early on, there were actually a couple of different hybrid cars launched at the same time. But what they did was they had this really unique shape of a car. And so we knew you cared about sustainability just because we saw your car, and we call this social signaling. And so now we can take this little nugget about social signaling and say, oh, okay, how does this apply in this domain where I'm asking people to recycle or reuse or something like that? So that's a really good example of problem immersion. I can move on.
This is super interesting, especially the church, sports clubs, even the hybrid cars. There's a podcast I occasionally listen to called Sounds Like a Cult. Like all of those groups, like the close, you want to be close to the line, but not cross the line, basically, with what you're doing there, like sports clubs and hybrids. This is really interesting. This is super cool. Yeah, let's talk about a bit. So that's the problem immersion. That's step one. That's the actual step one. Let's talk about one more step. We don't want to reveal the whole framework. People need to pay you to do the work for them, obviously.
Totally.
But what is the most common problem someone might encounter when they're trying to apply the framework?
Yeah, actually, usually it comes at the very beginning of the process with this identifying the key behavior. So like when we're in a room with a group of organizations, we say, okay, what is the key behavior you actually like to move? And we kind of ask them to do this as an independent exercise. And what you see is people come back with all sorts of answers. And we worked with YouTube when we were under kind of a Google umbrella. We stood up the behavioral economics unit there, worked with 25 different teams. One of the teams was YouTube, and went around and asked the room, is a room full of executives, what is the key behavior you want to drive on YouTube's homepage? And some people said, okay, well, subscriptions. I want people to subscribe to a particular content creator. Other people said create playlists. Well, when we actually looked at YouTube's landing page, it looks like the key behavior you want to drive is browsing. Versus if you look at Netflix quite publicly has said the key behavior they want is that a user watches a show within 7 seconds of opening the app. That is extremely specific. And we would hypothesize that moves behavior. There's a reason they've kind of taken that approach. So when it comes to key behaviors, we often get a lot of dissent around what this should be. And if there is dissent, if there's not consensus, if there's not alignment around a key behavior, that shows up in the design. Another great example of this is if you look at financial services institutions, recently, I won't name names, but there are some top banks in the US that have very clear, they want you to do something today. One example is I saw a family in the hero image. I saw a CTA that said, open the Kohl's card. And they're trying to tell you all about these differences in the benefits for this very particular audience. They're creating unique fit for me. I feel like I will be able to gain more from this card because of this perception of idiosyncratic fit. I talked a little bit about idiosyncratic fit in Amsterdam at the conference you were at, but it's this belief that we are uniquely suited for this offer. All of their executives kind of converge on this, the one product we like to drive, and it's for this type of user. Therefore, there's this one CTA with a visually congruent image versus another top 5 bank where there are so many different directions that the user's attention is being drawn and you see a very salient login. What's the problem with that? If someone has an account, directed intent, they're going to find a login opportunity. So that's just kind of wasted space. If you think about the other CTAs within the space, they had one that is like, find an ATM near you. Again, very highly intent driven traffic who will find the ATM link. So again, wasted space. Then they have 4 different offers for different products across the screen. I don't know where I should put my attention. It was probably on login or ATM, but now if I've gotten to the third most salient aspect of their screen, I have a lot of different offers competing for my cognitive resources. And again, what we know about choice paralysis is when decisions are hard, when there really isn't a clear next step, people will bounce.
So one follow-up question there, is an explicit or an implicit CTA better in the hero section?
What do you mean by implicit CTA?
Well, I mean, go find the closest ATM is about as direct as it gets. What if it's something like start creating your future today, start saving to, like, whatever it is, but it's not a direct first step you need to take that the call to action asks you to do.
Good. I think this is back to context matters. So where are people in the funnel, of course? Like, do they have a mental model for what your product is? Are they highly incented traffic, or are they in kind of a browsing or shopping mode? And what do we know about their mindset at that point? From a behavioral perspective, we kind of lean less on personas because these are out of date almost as soon as the strategy is set for the persona. But we do think about mindsets a lot. Like, is someone confident, especially as it relates to financial habits or health related habits, or are they kind of coming from a space of low confidence, and what can we do to get them over the hump? So indirect answer is it depends. And it kind of depends on these mindsets and where they are in the funnel, and like how congruent are all these different elements. What you were describing actually sounds like a headline, and then is the CTA then the button that they should follow, or the next step that they should take, is that congruent with that headline and the other elements of the page?
And don't feel bad about it depends. CRO is an industry. It depends industry. Everything is an it depends. So that's just how it is. I can only thank you. This was a great interview. Such a pleasure to talk to you after that conference when I saw your amazing, amazing presentation. I really, really loved it. Not just because of the bear reference, obviously. Where can people find you online?
We are at irrationallabs.com. And you can, of course, follow me on LinkedIn. I do share a lot of our case studies and get some engagement there. And it's nice to hear when people have tried these things and can tell me a little bit about their audiences and did it work? And in what context did it work? And so that's really fun for us.
That's the whole point. Thank you again. And to everyone listening to the podcast, please consider rating, reviewing, sharing, and I will talk to you next week.